Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on the first day of summer. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies. This is the fifth and final event in this year's Research Group on Constitutional Studies Lecture Series. We begin by acknowledging that McGill University is situated on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose continuing presence marks this place on which the peoples of the world now meet. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies, a unit of the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, brings together scholars at all levels, from faculty to undergraduate, from mainly political science, philosophy, and law, who approach the study of the foundational institutions of political societies and orders from a variety of methodological perspectives, including normative, intellectual, historical, juridical, and empirical. That is to say, it brings together scholars in political theory and political philosophy, legal theory and legal philosophy, constitutional and public law, and constitutional level empirical political science. The RGCS Lecture Series brings leading researchers from around the world from that range of disciplines and neighboring ones, asking the researchers to speak on their ongoing research about the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in a way that is intellectually demanding but still accessible to an advanced student audience, on the principle that excellent researchers are very often excellent teachers, and we think that the current university system often doesn't give people enough opportunity to be both of those at the same time. And we ask our visiting speakers to be both of those at the same time, and for over a decade now, they have been living up to that task. We are very happy to welcome back to McGill and to RGCS today, Kevin Elliott. Kevin Elliott returns to RGCS after having last been here to take part in the 2018 conference on political theory in and as political science, which launched an ongoing multi-university collaboration of which RGCS is the anchor partner. And Kevin Elliott's research really exemplifies the kind of thing that we across the universities that are continuing the political theory, political science project are trying to encourage and to have see happen. He works in normative democratic theory, but as you will see in this afternoon's talk, he does so in ways that are deeply informed by wide knowledge and serious study of empirical political science across a range of the ways that empirical political science engages with democracy. He studies not only the empirics of democratic institutions and procedures, but also questions of political psychology and political behavior, and treats seriously not only the formal institutions of governing constitutional political orders, but also crucial intervening institutions such as political parties, to engage with questions of how it is that we should normatively think about democracy once we have taken seriously a variety of kinds of information, knowledge, and constraints that we will learn about in the real world and will build into the theory from an early stage, not applying them only at the end as unfortunate moments of compromise with reality. Kevin Elliott is lecturer in the Department of Ethics, Politics, and Economics, Ethics, Politics, and Economics, yes, at Yale University, having previously been assistant professor of political science at Murray State University. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, an MA from the London School of Economics, and a bachelor's from UCLA. He has widely published across the leading disciplines in political theory and political science, including the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Perspectives on Politics and Political Theory. And he is the author of the recently published book that shares a title with tonight's talk from the University of Chicago Press. He will be speaking to us on the themes from the book, Democracy for Busy People. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Elliott.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. We all have other things we could be doing with our time, as my talk and my book are very intensely aware of. So I very much appreciate your attention. The problem for which my book is an attempt to deal with is the problem I call the problem of unequal busyness. To give you a sense of this, we all understand that some people are busier than others. This is a very straightforward phenomenon we recognize in the world. Some people have children to take care of. Some people have to work more hours in the day to make ends meet. Some people have sick parents or otherwise other kinds of care obligations that will make them busy in ways that other people are not, will give them less time in the world for other things that they might otherwise like to be spending their time on. Now, when I say the term, when I name busy people, for some that will conjure in their minds people who are, sort of jet setters, have schedules full of high stakes meetings, right, and are maybe kind of, taking a car to the next major thing that they have. But those are really not the kind of busy people that I am most concerned about. As the kinds of busyness I mentioned might suggest, I'm mainly concerned about people who are waging a daily battle against bills, burnout, and the neglect of their loved ones, perhaps also trying to maintain a modicum of sanity, which we are not always able to do. This type of busy person, for me, and the motivating kind of character in the interstices of the book is my mother, who for me is the stereotypical busy person. When I was a child, she was a single working mother without a college degree, and she is exactly the type of person who did not have time for politics, did not see its relevance, at least compared to the other things that were of superlative importance. So for me, the way that I think about busyness is a kind of incomplete, but nonetheless common currency of disadvantage. There are a variety of different kinds of disadvantage that people experience in the world, which is cashed out in terms of busyness. I'm happy to talk more about this, but that's what I mean by busyness. So what does this have to do with democracy? Well, fairly straightforwardly, people who are busy are unavailable, comparatively unavailable, for the activities of democratic politics. They have less time available. They are able to devote less of the attention that they have left over after life's necessities for engaging in democratic politics. But the challenge is that despite their inability to participate, they are still entitled to democratic equality. They are still entitled to have their interests considered by those who wield power and those who make the law. This brings us to the problem of unequal busyness as I understand it. The question being, how can we get democratic equality if people are unequally busy and so will never participate on an equal basis? How can we get these two things together? So in some form or another, this is not an unfamiliar problem. But there are some approaches that previous people have sort of waved their hands at, perhaps, to try to take care of this problem that I think are not going to be sufficient. One of these is the idea that if only we could sort of give people enough resources, perhaps provide public services that are currently lacking, that this will take care of the problem of unequal busyness. Yet it seems to me that even if we lived in a world of fully automated luxury communism, where we don't have scarcity anymore and everybody has, in principle, as much time as they need to make whatever kind of life they would like, there are going to be some people who have sick parents or children that they want to take care of themselves. There will be some people who will choose artistic projects or other kinds of enthralling do-it-yourself activities that will absorb their free time. People will always be unequally busy. People are always going to choose politics at unequal rates. And it seems to me this is an ineradicable feature of pluralism in societies. So, one of the things we're not going to be able to do is solve it by simply giving people more money. They're going to make choices that are going to make them unequally busy. And in some cases, we might think that the choices that people make are kind of trivial or unreasonable. Why do you spend so much time on art? Why do you spend so much time on your garden, as the case may be? But of course, we all have different ideas about what's important in life. And it seems to me that we are, despite the choices that we make and despite the disagreements we have about how we ought to spend our time, about what is important in life, about what a good life looks like, we are again nonetheless entitled to democratic equality. It also seems to me that we can't solve the problem of unequal busyness by making better opportunities to participate. This is another approach that some people have taken to try to fix this problem. I'll say more about this in a moment. But for the moment, let me simply say that some people think if you just build better ways for people to participate, this will itself solve the problem of unequal busyness. If you build it, they will come. Right? Better ways of participating, right? Less thin electoral ways of participation will be enough to attract people like moths to a flame. So then people will come and will use these ways to get involved. But again, as I'll discuss, the best evidence we have about the causes of political participation suggests that this is just untrue as an empirical matter. Those who have the resources to take advantage of new ways of participating will typically be able to dominate these new ways of participating, and they will be able to reinforce the advantages that they already have in society. This is a kind of intensification of the problem of unequal busyness that I call the paradox of empowerment. I'll say more about that here in a minute. Ultimately, the exclusion that arises from the problem of unequal busyness is one that cannot be squared with core values of democracy like equality, like collective self-rule. I'm happy to talk about that more if people have additional questions, but this is a straightforward problem that we don't have an obvious solution to. So, what are we going to do about the problem of unequal busyness if it is here to stay? In the book, I decompose this problem into two separate challenges. The first is the ethical challenge, and the second is the institutional challenge. The ethical challenge asks, can busy people even be good democratic citizens? Is that open to them at all? My answer is yes. But it requires us to develop new ideas about what makes a good citizen, about what it takes to be a good citizen. And it requires institutional expectations that match this changed idea of what it means to be a good citizen. The institutional challenge follows on from this, right, where the question here is what kinds of institutions will enable busy people to be politically included, which will allow them to be politically equal as far as possible. And the answer that I explore is that institutions that concentrate power, where participation is cheap and easy, where it is the most open to all, and institutions that make politics easily understandable will be the ones that enable busy people to be included as equals in democratic politics. To give you a sense of what's in the book is divided into two parts. Part 1, how much democratic citizenship addresses the ethical challenge, and Part 2, democratic institutions for busy people addresses, naturally, the institutional challenge. So these are the chapters. If you're interested, check out the book. There's more details about that there. What I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is going to be drawn largely from chapters 3, 5, and 6. So if you're like, that sounds very interesting, well, go check out chapter 5 or whatever. It'll be apparent. So, moving forward. What can democracy be for us today? A lot of people who are concerned about democracy, who are concerned to save democracy, or if they're not as taken with democratic backsliding, if they are simply thinking about how to improve democracy today, they'll tend to think that improving democracy, that saving democracy requires ordinary citizens to participate in one way or another in more deep ways in public life, in democracy itself. The familiar slogan for this, coming from Jane Addams and John Dewey in the early 20th century, was the idea that the cure for democracy's ills is more democracy, always more democracy. That's how you solve the problems of democracy. And in a variety of ways, most of them take ancient Athens, which is the image here. So you might be wondering, what does that do with ancient? Ancient Athens is often taken to be the kind of guiding example. We need to take some kind of features of the ancient Athenian democracy and somehow kind of graft it onto our contemporary world. That will be the way to give us more democracy. At least in inspiration, if not in actual institutions. Since we're not in Athens, well, what does this actually mean? What are people actually talking about? What does more democracy actually mean? There have been at least 4 large categories that we will find the literature breaking down into when people are thinking about how we get more democracy, where we should look for it. One of these is in associations and civil society. The idea, Robert Putnam's famous book sort of articulates this idea that it's within the space between the state and the economy that we have this space of civil society, and it's the organizations there that organize people to be able to exercise collective power in ways that will allow them to either challenge the power of the wealthier groups of people, right? And that's the way that we want to go in order to improve democracy. Another extraordinarily high-profile one, especially these days, is looking to social movements. In the United States, of course, the civil rights movement, and more recently, the movement for Black Lives, are seen as the most promising ways for building power that can improve the inclusiveness of democracy, bring voices that have been excluded, that have not been taken into account in the dealings of those who hold power. Among democratic reformers, probably the one that has gotten the most attention and certainly has come to command the largest share of reformer resources have been various reforms that emphasize deliberation. Either deliberative mini-publics is one of the most common ways that this works, but also various forms of sortition-based forums where you have randomly selected citizens getting together to talk about the problems and trying to come up with solutions together. This is why it's in bold. It's like the most kind of, probably the largest literature and certainly the most activist resources are probably devoted to deliberation. And then, of course, we also have the option, especially in the post, after the financial crisis, we saw across various polities the possibility of spontaneous collective action that we see in various forms of protest politics and various forms of street politics, including Occupy Wall Street and the other kind of cognate movements in other places that have attempted to create a more participatory politics in the streets, right, in the city squares, right, trying to instantiate this type of alternative politics, much more participatory, much more direct, and much more spontaneously organized rather than institutionalized. Ultimately, many theorists argue that these forms of participation are going to put more power into the hands of the people, especially marginalized people, ultimately including my busy people. But my reservations about these forms of participation have a lot to do with their demandingness, the costs that are associated with them. It's fairly clear all forms of political participation are costly, at least in terms of time, at least in terms of what economists call opportunity costs, the other things you could be doing, right? So all participation is costly, but some forms of participation are more costly than others. And these particular forms are extraordinarily costly. And these costs operate, as I'm suggesting with this provocative comparison, that these costs operate like a poll tax. Ultimately, the paying of these costs are the price that we have to pay in order to exercise our right as democratic citizens to be heard, to have our say. We have to foot the bill for these forms of participation in order to be heard. And that's the sense in which these operate sort of like a poll tax. Now, what's the problem with poll taxes? Well, it won't surprise you to know, right? Has to do with what I mentioned before, the paradox of empowerment. Many of the ways that reformers have sought to improve democracy over the past several years have involved these highly demanding forms of participation. And there's an assumption in the background of many of these theorists, in some ways a kind of faith in ordinary people, that if you open up the doors to the halls of power, that people will rush in. Right? This is what I mentioned this before, the if you build it, they will come hypothesis. Right? If you build more attractive, meaningful, deep forms of political participation, this will inspire people to come to it. The analysis standing in the background here is that the reason that people like my mother do not make the time for politics is that it's meaningless. It's thin. How much is voting actually? What does it actually mean as a form of participation? How meaningful is it as a form of participation? And if that's right, then people should rush in when we build these, when we open the doors to the Capitol. My concern is that when we open new ways, seemingly new ways to participate, and these ways of participation are highly demanding, extremely costly, that this will in fact perversely reinforce the power and advantages of those who are already powerful and advantaged in society, because they are the ones who are in the best position to take advantage of these new, more costly ways to participate. Let me just spell out this logic just a bit more clearly. Really only has two parts. It's not that complicated. One, participation is costly. I already mentioned this. In vogue forms of participation like deliberation are especially costly. And advantaged groups are the ones who have the resources and are best situated to make use of these costly opportunities to participate. And as a result, these demanding forms of participation will tend to empower the already advantaged. Now that might sound, okay, that sounds interesting. Okay, is that actually the case? Well, let me show you some examples. We see this all the time. It's actually extraordinarily common. One of the first places that we see this is campaign finance. Right? So in the United States, I don't actually know the rules here in Canada quite as much, but in the United States, it is legal to give lots of money to parties, to candidates, and to spend money to influence the way that people think about politics and how they should vote. This is a very, very clear case of the paradox of empowerment. Why? Well, one of the ways of thinking about giving money to candidates is as a form of democratic participation. You might not share that view. That is the view of the Supreme Court of the United States. And so it's kind of stuck with it for the time being. And if you think of it as a form of democratic participation, it's very clear how this is a case of the paradox of empowerment, because who has the opportunity, right, to actually make use of this form of participation? Those who have lots of money on hand. And this basic structure, I argue, is the case for many other forms of democratic participation, particularly these more demanding participatory forms. Another clear example are local meetings. I don't know if you can see this quite, but this was a picture taken at a rally. It was meant to be like a public meeting, when it became a kind of rally, about a high-speed rail line that was going to connect the city of Houston to the city of Dallas. Now, maybe you'll notice the people in this crowd. A lot of gray hair here. Now, I'll have you know, the city of Houston is 46% white, 45% Hispanic, 23% black, and 7% Asian. Don't know if that quite reflects the crowd that we're seeing here. I would say maybe not. Also, Houston is 25% of its population is under the age of 18. Only 11% is over the age of 65. Again, it's just one picture, who knows? But, well, we do know, as a matter of fact, this is just a suggestive example. We know, as a matter of fact, that the people who attend community board meetings, city planning committee, city planning meetings, local planning committee meetings, they tend to be disproportionately older, whiter, more likely to be property owners, and more wealthy than the average members of the community. This is another excellent example of the paradox of empowerment. I will only belabor. Now, I can give you lots of other examples. I'm just going to use one other one because you're probably thinking, well, these seem like kind of like old forms of participation. I will grant you the paradox of empowerment here, but what about these innovative new democratic institutions, deliberative mini publics? We also see it there. Even in the case of citizens' assemblies, Canada has more experience with these than many other places in some of the most exciting areas of policymaking, electoral reform, at least for those of us who are election nerds. What you're seeing here are the three citizens' assemblies that were about electoral reform in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in the Netherlands. And what you're seeing here is the percentage of the population in the darker colors, which are by education. So in British Columbia, roughly 20% of the population did not have a college degree when the Citizens' Assembly was held in 2007. And roughly 25% did have a college degree. But on the Citizens' Assembly, about 5% did not have a college degree, and nearly 60% did have a college degree. What you're seeing here is massive overrepresentation on each of these citizens' assemblies of well-educated people, right? And so if you think that well-educated people look like the rest of the population, then this is great. But if you're concerned that well-educated people do not necessarily look like the rest of the population in terms of demographic characteristics we're concerned about, right, then this should concern us, that this is another instance of the paradox of empowerment. Thus, I hope to have suggested to you that the paradox of empowerment is real, not merely theoretical, and it perversely undermines core democratic values of inclusion and equality. So what should we do? Well, I would suggest we should do as Dr. Seuss suggests in this old 1942 comic, right before the abolition of poll taxes in the United States. What we should do is we should abolish these turnstiles, which are only allowing the advantaged into the empowered spaces of our democracies. If we address the paradox of empowerment at its root, what we should be looking to do is we should be looking to make participation as simple and low cost as possible. Only then will busy people have a shot at democratic equality. This is my thought. What this means, the upshot of this, is that closing off some types of participation, especially ones that are expensive like campaign finance, but potentially even forms of deliberative empowerment, can paradoxically further the cause of democratic equality. Key lesson of this, the upshot of this, I hope you will take away from this. I'm going to come back to this point, so I made it bold and big. If you want democracy to be equal, you have to make it undemanding. If you want democracy to be more nearly egalitarian, you need to make participation in it something that ordinary people can do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to transition to talk more about, well, how would we do that? So let's talk about how we can make democracy more accessible. If we want to make participation cheap and easy, there's lots of different ways of doing it. And there's different dimensions along which we might try to do this. The most obvious way is making it easy to vote. A democracy for busy people would deploy the most sort of well-known ways and make it easy to vote. Automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, making election day a holiday, these types of things, which many democracies have and the United States has none of. We're not doing well on these easy ways of making it easy to vote. But not only this. There are other ways to do this, which I want to talk about. But some people at this point might be thinking, if we make it easy for people to participate, won't some people participate that maybe we'd be better off without? This is the familiar concern of political incompetence, sometimes talked about in terms of voter ignorance, right? Won't we make it easy for people who, if they can't quite figure out how to register to vote, aren't we better off without them? So went the reasoning of many democratic reformers in the early 20th century who in fact imposed voter registration partly to dissuade lower educated, poorer people from voting. Now, most approaches to this problem ultimately blame citizens. They point the finger. Calling it citizen incompetence is naming the problem as a problem that individuals have, right? These people are too stupid to participate in politics, to participate responsibly, what have you. But I want to ask, what if this is ultimately a problem of the rules and institutions of democracy itself? In other words, what if changing the institutions themselves, what if rethinking what their purpose is can help actually address this problem? And this is one of the key dimensions of accessibility that I want to emphasize, and I emphasize in my book. And that is, we want to make politics understandable. Right? This is a neglected but extremely consequential dimension of the high cost of participation, is what I call the cognitive tractability of politics. The strained metaphor I use here is a car, right? Has traction on the road, right? Voters, right? If we can follow the train of what's happening, right? If politics is cognitively tractable for us, we can follow the twists and turns of the political agenda. We can follow what a particular electoral choice or campaign is about in a way that we can't if politics is extremely complicated and no one is in a position, no one has the incentive to explain it to us, to make it simple, to try to ultimately reduce the dimensions of a political choice to one or a few. So we can think of this, what I mean by tractability, as the ability of the citizen's mind to grip onto politics. And when it loses traction, it can slide off into apathy, right? Citizens can be pushed out of politics by not being able to follow what's happening. Strained metaphor, I know, but I'm trying to do it. I'm trying here. All right, so how the question that cognitive tractability invites is, how easy is it for citizens to understand politics? The institutions of democracy, I argue, can make politics easier for citizens to understand or harder for them to understand. And so we might think about trying to make politics easier to understand using two different strategies. One is that we can try to make it easy to identify who is responsible for policy outcomes. And two, we can try to scaffold the understanding of citizens regarding the issues and the stakes of a particular electoral choice. So I'm going to talk about things that might block each of these strategies in turn. So blocks to tractability. Let's talk institutions. Federalism. Okay. Federalism is complicated. Okay, it makes it hard to understand what's happening. Particularly, it can make it very hard to know who to blame when things are going badly. So, to give you an example, Medicaid expansion. I know half of you fell asleep, I apologize. In the United States, health insurance is a problem. Access to health insurance is a problem. Back in 2008, 2010 technically, the Democrats passed a bill called the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, trying to expand health insurance. The primary way they did that was by expanding Medicaid. Did I say Medicare expansion? Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion. Pardon me. Sorry. Medicaid expansion. And for a complicated set of reasons, the Medicaid expansion became something that was optional for states. It was not supposed to be optional for states except under extreme costly circumstances. The Supreme Court intervened to make it optional for states. Now, the states that are in dark blue here have expanded Medicaid, and the states in orange have not. If you're living in an orange state, who do you blame for not having health insurance if you're one of the people who would have received health insurance under the expanded Medicaid? It's kind of complicated, because your state government was involved, but so was the Supreme Court, and so was Congress, who could have figured out a way to get around the Supreme Court, but they didn't, right? There were a variety of actors involved that made this ultimately a much more complicated thing to understand for voters who might want to have made a change. And so I understand, by the way, that I've come to Canada to preach against federalism, in Quebec, no less. And yet my conscience allows me to do no other. I apologize. The alternative to federalism, for those of you who are like, well, what would the alternative be? It's called a unitary system. And in a unitary system, typically, the national government can get its way. Right? Maybe the lower units will have some ability to push back, but ultimately the national government can get its way. So that would be an alternative that might make things more understandable. If you could say, look, if there's a problem and my local government is getting in the way, In a unitary system, there's no excuse. The national government is always in a position to push back. Another potential block to tractability, and here I'm attacking my own country's system, not yours, is checks and balances, right? So in the United States, of course, famously, we have 3 branches of government that are like co-equal, supposedly, unless you read the Constitution, then you're like, well, clearly Congress is supposed to be. Anyway, so, right, well, the way it works is, right, we've got 3 branches, and they're all in a position to make it hard for the others to get things done. And so, again, as a voter, who do you blame for things going badly? One of the examples that from recent history is if you are one of the, 80 million Americans who might have benefited from Joe Biden's first attempt to forgive all student loans, who do you blame for your student loans not being forgiven? Joe Biden for not doing a better job, for Congress for not passing a law doing it, for SCOTUS for getting in the way? Again, I'm not sure. It's complicated, and I don't know who to blame. I don't know who to punish, right? I don't know who to vote against. Key. Making things even more complicated in many other places, or in lots of places, basically everywhere in the last few years, who do I blame for inflation? We got this other actor over here in the background, right? Where do they stand? How do I punish them, right? Well, by design, you can't. Well, okay, but what are we talking about here, right? This makes it hard for voters to know who to blame. It makes it hard for voters to know what to do. And if my issue is inflation, I might not have an option. As in other words, I might not have a reason to vote if I'm most concerned about that problem. So one way of responding to problems of checks and balances is the lovely system that Canada has been bequeathed with, as many other countries have developed on their own. Parliamentarism is a more simple way of structuring the fundamental authority of a government, one in which the legislature appoints the executive, and if the legislature does not like the executive, they get rid of it. Right? Various methods for doing that. Maybe it leads to chaos in certain contexts, but nonetheless, if you have a problem, you know exactly who to blame. The legislature. They are in a position to typically get their way. I put a dotted line to the Supreme Court because, well, things have gotten complicated with courts in lots of places, but that's slightly different. I mean, that is a part of the same story, I should say, but I don't want to emphasize that. I don't have a worked out view on that at the moment. Anyway, so in a parliamentary system, you've got fewer checks and simpler politics that are more understandable for citizens. Another example of a lack of tractability is what's sometimes called the long ballot. What you're looking at here are 2 sample ballots. This one comes from the UK, and this one is for East Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, you can't really see this, but what you're looking at here are votes for president, votes for constitutional amendments, local propositions. I believe there's sheriffs, aldermans. What we're looking at here are all of the complicated choices that you're given. Sometimes they say in the United States we vote for everyone from president to dog catcher, and that's what this looks like, right? One of the ways that the complexity of the US political system in particular shows up to citizens is in the length of the ballot. And so as a voter, this is hard. Simply coming to the voting booth and know. When I first started voting, I lived in California. Came of age in California, which someone's laughing. Somebody knows what I'm about to say, which is very notable for usually having 10, 15 propositions on any given ballot, some of which are highly technical about where the money should go, or about you've got like dueling insurance regulation schemes on there at times, and it's very challenging, very difficult. And so that ballot is much simpler. I make one mark, and then it's up to them, essentially, right? Again, clearer lines of authority, very complicated task for voters. This is more tractable than that. Fairly straightforward, hopefully. Short ballot, tractable, long ballot, not. Okay. Now, the other dimension, the other strategy for making politics understandable is trying to get someone to help citizens to understand the stakes of a given democratic choice. And here I turn to political parties, which tend to not get the respect I believe that they deserve. Parties are often seen, certainly in the United States, we get some of this from certain kinds of centrists, will say parties are a key source of democracy's ills, and reformers are often looking for ways to circumvent or abolish them. If you've heard of the movement No Labels, is like one of these kind of like attempts to kind of build a party that's anti-party. Anti-partyism has a long and proud history, as Nancy Rosenblum wrote in a recent book, not that recent book at this point, but a very good book. But taking this attitude towards political parties as a problem for democracy is a mistake, because parties are essential for scaffolding the participation of busy citizens. What do I mean by that? How do parties scaffold participation? What I mean by that is that because parties are competing with each other, they are trying to persuade voters to support them. And because of that, they have an enormous capacity built up for generating persuasive messages. Parties are desperate to tell you why you should vote for them, because it's going to help them win power, right? They're not your friends. They don't care necessarily about you as an individual, but they want your vote. And so they are institutionally constrained to try to convince you to vote for them. And so they are trying to bombard you with persuasive messages as to why you should do that. Now, the thing about these messages is that these messages carry information about the political parties. They carry information about the current campaign. They carry information about the electoral choice that you're facing, the issues that are at play today, and the stakes of a given electoral choice that voters can then choose to adopt or reject, right? And also, parties are competitively trying to identify which issues are most important. Are trans rights important? Is climate change important? These are things that parties are conveying to voters as a matter, as a side effect, as a byproduct of their attempt to win power. Again, parties are power hungry. And if they're power hungry, then they're trying to convince you. And they're trying to give you information, right, about what the choice, what the choice means at a given point. So, the key point here is that citizens do not have to supply the information themselves. You don't have to go out into the information environment and really do a deep dive. I got to read that 50-page information. No, right? The parties will give you the information. They're desperate to give it to you. So, these messages ultimately, right, will also help clarify the stakes of electoral choices. The upshot here is that parties simplify politics for citizens. In a competitive environment, we can call this the ecological simplification function of parties. The ecological situation of competition simplifies the electoral choice for citizens and makes it understandable for them. Citizens don't need to inform themselves. By bringing information and meaning to them, with them into politics, parties want to supply it. So ultimately, political parties are powerful institutions for promoting the equality of busy people. This is my conclusion. At least if they're facing, you notice the stars are very important, right? The asterisks here are very important if parties face competition. One of the big problems we have in the United States is that the parties in the vast majority of places in the United States do not face competitive politics at all. I moved from California, in my adult life, I've lived in California, New York, Kentucky, and now Connecticut. Not in one of those states have I seen a competitive presidential election. Not in my lifetime have I voted competitively for a presidential election. That's not great for promoting the kind of competition I'm talking about. All right. So, in conclusion, this is the cover of my book, by the way. I tried to put it on the cover of the thing, but it's not quite there. Anyway, so that's what it looks like. So, in conclusion, improving or saving democracy today requires more than just opening new ways to participate. That's not going to cut it. The paradox of empowerment means that we should look for ways to make participation cheap and easy. And we should be skeptical of deeper, more demanding modes of participation. Remember, again, if you take anything out of this talk, what I hope you take out of this talk is that if you want democracy to be more equal, you must make it undemanding. And institutions, they can simplify the lines of accountability and responsibility, and they can clarify political choices, which helps to make politics cognitively tractable for busy citizens who then don't have to do enormous amounts of work trying to inform themselves in some kind of unrealistic way. That's it. I want to just end with this frontispiece. I had a vision once when this book was in the formative stages of a simple pictorial representation of the argument of the book. And then I gave it to my 11-year-old daughter, who draws better than I do. And so here you have a busy citizen reaching the things of work, child, bills, and on the other side, we have indicators of forms of participation, and the only one that the busy person can reach is the ballot box. And over here, we have a well-dressed, organized person, right, who's able to reach all of the different tools of participation much more easily and is concerted in their efforts towards them. So we want to concentrate power where people can reach it, and thank you, my daughter Iris, because this is like, hey, if you get this, you get the argument. There you go. Thank you all very much.
At RGCS Lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies, Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. We've got a bunch of hands, and I'll just start to move them back. Felix and then Natalie.
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested about the issue regarding how much free time people do in fact have at their disposal to participate in politics. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts of what that requires of employers directly.
So this semester I'm teaching a course where we're reading some of the work that's been done on discretionary time and free time by people like Bob Gooden and Julie Rose. And there you have a lot of, I think there's a fair amount of thinking about the way that welfare regimes can distribute time and also can help kind of offset the costs of raising families in a variety of ways. When it comes to employers, I think that one of the institutions that I mentioned here that definitely plays a role are labor unions, right? So you can have, when workers are in a position to have the conditions of their labor put, if not under their direct control, because there's a way in which workplace democracy creates problems for democracy for busy people, because it becomes another place that you have to have all the thoughts about how we should sort of work things together. But I emphasize representative democracy. The term didn't occur here because it's kind of in the background. But when you can have labor relations also operate on a representational basis, that's another way to kind of get people more control in a way that's not necessarily demanding to them. So in answer to your question, I think employers do have a role. It is good when you can have, when workers are not necessarily in a position to be exploited. You don't only have to be concerned about democracy or free time in the way that I'm talking about it to have that concern, obviously. But when it comes to free time, it is better for people to have more of it. That is my view, and I think that's a matter of justice, and that's part of the argument that I make about the importance of free time, is that it is, in fact, an entitlement of justice, insofar as workers are not able to do that because their employers are in a position to put unreasonable demands on their time. That is an injustice, and whichever way that we can think of to do that, to address that, that is also responsive to these concerns about the paradox of empowerment and some of these concerns about sort of the distribution of free time. You'd want to have these kinds of concerns in mind, especially when we think about things like workplace democracy. Thank you.
So coming from the States, something I found very interesting about the Canadian democratic system is that there's a form of multi-partisanship. Yeah. And I'm curious what you think about how multi-partisanship would affect parties as scaffolding participation, because sometimes the lines between these on a federal level versus provincial level can look very different. For instance, BC Liberals versus federal Liberals are very different stereotypically. And do you think that this may make things more competitive for the parties? Or do you think it just makes it more confusing for the average citizen who just wants to participate in politics? Yeah,
I think so. I tend to think that multi-party politics in general is quite healthy, in part because it creates the problem with two-party competition is that there are these pockets of uncompetitiveness, right? So it's very easy for many areas to fall into uncompetitiveness, and that's just poison for the kind of concerns that I have. Multi-party politics, especially where you have national-level PR, which I understand you don't have here, but when you do have national-level PR, you will have competition in all parts of the country can take place along multiple frontiers of competition, if you will, right? So if you put all the parties on a unidimensional space, in the places between the parties, you will have, like, those are frontiers of competition. That's why two-party competition is bad, because it's only one frontier. And so the agenda gets very spare and very, there's not a lot of space on it, right? But when you've got multiple parties, right, then you have lots of different frontiers of competition, so there's more space on the political agenda. One of the things that's healthy about that is that people who are concerned with issues that fall outside of a two-party competition, they can find other issues that they're interested in. So that's why I think multi-party politics is very healthy for a democracy for busy people. It opens up the agenda for concerns that people like, hey, there's no difference on the issues I care about between the two parties. If you've got multiple parties, well, now I have a party to vote for. So when it comes to fragmentation across the federal, state, federal, provincial level, yeah, that's probably a problem, it would seem to me, insofar as by voting for your state provincial party, you're not sure if you're voting for the agenda articulated by the national party. Right? I'm not sure if this is the case here, but it certainly is the case in the United States, that national politics is much more legible for people because it gets a lot more political coverage. Partly that's due to changes in the media, right? We've seen a huge amount of destruction, for lack of a better term, of local media sources, and that has made state politics in the United States, again, I don't know what the situation is here in Canada, I would imagine it would be similar, where there are state capitals where there might only be a couple of reporters who are covering all of the issues that are going on in a state capital. That's not good, right? Among other things, that's going to make the politics that are going on there between whatever parties there are not as visible to people. National politics has the advantage of a very big spotlight. It makes it much more kind of, it's written in the sky in a way, right? So yeah, that's part of my anti-federalism pitch. But yes, so yes, when you have this disjuncture between state level politics and national level politics, that becomes a problem for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your very thought-provoking talk. I'm going to sidestep the federalism issue, although I think it's a really important and interesting one, and ask a question which I'm sure you addressed in your first chapter, and that is, how do we measure busyness, and what is the difference between a person who is too busy for politics and a person who simply sets non-political priorities? Good.
So the way that I understand busyness is that both of those people would be busy, right? There is a temptation, I think, to try and draw a bright line between people who are, like, sort of strictly speaking, do not have the free time, even as a matter of sort of like budgeting of like the minutes they have a day to engage in political activity, and people who are making choices that shape the outcomes of their time in ways that are incompatible with political participation. I mentioned the work of Bob Gooden on discretionary time, and this is an objection to that project. The way that he and his co-authors kind of construct this idea of the time people are supposed to have, they really define the minimum of how much time people must spend at work. And taking care of themselves and doing domestic labor extremely low. So because of the way that they do that, people, as an accounting matter, have huge amounts of free time. And then they say, okay, so people are making all sorts of choices regarding how they're going to use their discretionary time, which is a very large share of time. It seems to me that if you try to draw a bright line between free time and no free time, in the way that would invite you to say, these people are busy in a way that's a problem, and these people are busy because they're making choices, I don't think that's going to be ultimately tenable. I think it's a philosophically interesting distinction, but it's not a practically interesting one, because this is why I give the example of taking care of your own children, right? There are daycare services available in lots of places, but like if somebody's like, I don't want my kids to be in care, and then you say, okay, as a result of that choice, you're not entitled to democratic equality. That's the kind of point where I'd say, well, yeah, I mean, I guess you kind of have a choice here, but you're also involved in those choices that shape what life is worth, right? Like the ultimate value of life, and what a good life looks like, right? And I don't think we should be in the position to be drawing those kinds of lines when it comes to matters of democratic institutional design.
Okay, so thank you for taking time to come speak with us today. My question is kind of pushing back on your affinity for political parties. Because of the rise of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, if political parties know that they provide the scaffolding and the information to the busy citizens, could they not be more incentivized to kind of provide, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but misinformation, knowing that they are the be-all end-all source of information for busy citizens?
Good, yes. So there's a couple of different things going on in your question. I think one of them has to do with the information environment, right? So insofar as we have an information environment that is less mediated, so let me put it this way. One of the key things that social media does is it disintermediates the news. So it removes people like editors and journalists who would ordinarily be in a position to scrutinize the claims of political parties and representatives and campaigns, right? So somebody from the Republican Party says, we're going to protect Medicare and Social Security. And then they say, it's funny because like your party has voted to, do away with those programs or whatever. It's part of your platform, right? That would be the task of journalists. One of the things that's happening due to social media is the disintermediation of that, so that the actor in the middle who's in a position to say, wait a minute, right? Let me check that claim, right, against what you said in the past and so forth. They are not around as much, right? They're being reduced. So insofar as that is the problem, it's a real one. One of the things that I would go back to here, though, is the issue of is competition, right? Because if one party is claiming to say we're going to protect these social safety net. Yes, social safety net programs. The other parties could be in a position to say they're liars, right? Like they're in a position to point out things that are factually true, right? And so that does create, to some extent, a burden on voters to have to adjudicate between those claims. To be sure, right? There's without media, independent media, that's a serious problem. So I think one of the things I would resort to is competition there. And so when you don't have competition, that's a problem. Another thing that's going on in your question is, I think, the phenomenon of partisanship. And depending on the way that we understand what partisanship consists in. So political science, I recently wrote an article about this. The primary way that political scientists will talk about partisanship these days is as a form of identity. Right? And so when your partisanship is a matter of your identity, then you're going to believe the things that your party says more readily than when your party is just like a group that you support, right? Are they you? No, not really, not necessarily, right? When you keep a degree of separation between yourself and your party, that enables you to, that opens up critical space where if your party leader makes some outlandish claim, you're in a position to open up a degree of criticality to that and say, no, I don't think so. That goes too far. So I think these are all different things that are going on. I do think that there's a problem in the information environment. I do think competition is one way to resolve some of these problems of parties attempting to kind of just lie to their voters. But insofar as their voters want to be lied to, right? Because it's like, well, that's what we do on our side of the aisle. There's not a good solution for that, right? Like that's not about busyness. That's about some other kinds of democratic pathologies. Thank you.
Will Roberts.
Thanks for the talk. So this is, I'm broadly sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to a huge amount of what you said, but I have a worry. It's sort of a worry about what I'm going to call a paradox of transition. So, since you like paradoxes. Okay. So and maybe you can help me get out of this because I would like to get out of it. So, the problem is that the modes of participating in politics are costly, and therefore the people who are able to participate in politics are those with the resources to bear those costs. And the reason that's a problem is because we expect that those people, those resourced people with lots of time and money, are not likely to represent well the interests and desires of the busy people who are excluded from politics, right? So how do we make a democracy for busy people? Well, we would have to engage in a bunch of political action that would be really costly, because we can't just vote on it because we don't have those institutions, right? So we would have to engage in politics that would be costly, resource intensive, et cetera, in order to arrive at democracy for busy people. But then that would mean that a bunch of people who had a lot of resources were doing something that was manifestly to the benefit of, in the interests of, those without much resources. So the paradox is that it seems like if we could build democracy for busy people, we wouldn't need to build democracy for busy people, because it seems as if these resource-intensive institutions and modes of interaction are actually doing, or at least can do, the work of representing the interests of the excluded.
Yes. Great. Yes. So I've become very interested in this. I'm so pleased that we're sort of talking about problems of transition, because I think that this is a big problem in the sort of political theory that I'm very interested in, institutionally interested in, and politically to some extent engaged. So yes. Now I think that the stories of political movements. So a couple of different things. One thing is, in the framework, I talk about the sort of minimum of democratic, I articulate a minimum of democratic citizenship called standby citizenship. The idea that the least that we can expect from citizens is that they're attentive to politics and are in a position to step into active political action when it's called for by their lights. Now, one of the elements of that ideal is what I call the upward flexibility, which is to say there's a difference between a citizen who's doing the minimum, a citizen who falls below the minimum, and an excellent citizen. So one of the ways of thinking about costly forms of participation is as doing more than the minimum. Right, so one of the big tasks I'm trying to do here is theorize the minimum, but it also opens the space for saying, right, when do we need people to be more than the minimum? And I hope to have created a space for that. And I think that's one of the ways that we think about what is called for, what do I need to do in a given moment. If my political judgment is telling me, democracy is in danger, and me simply voting is not going to be enough, I need to do more than that, then I can make other kinds of choices, coming back to this point about like the choices that we make in our lives, then I'm in a position to make choices that go beyond that minimum. And I think that what we see with the complexity, I use the term advantage, right, here purposefully, but when we disaggregate what that means, there's a lot of space for sort of cross-cutting forms of solidarity. So people who are well-educated, that's a form of advantage, but that doesn't necessarily track onto forms of economic. I mean, it does in the aggregate, right? So well-educated people are better off, but not always. And oftentimes, even if they are better off, they can still form solidarity with people who are not as well off. So there are opportunities for building, I think, coalitions across forms of advantage and disadvantage that we have seen, I think time and again in reform movements that are made up of a variety of different kinds of people. And you do have a space for people to go beyond. That's why we recognize people that are in social movements who go through incur enormous personal expenses. That's why we recognize their heroism. That's why we name days and raise statues to them. So many statues in Montreal. I'm sure not all of them are these types of heroes, but I think that this is probably not. I don't know. In any case, yes. So I hope that there's a space for this. I do think there is a space for the kind of thing that you're talking about, but I do think that the problem of transition it's not a trivial one, and I don't think that you can get to the kinds of reforms I'm talking about by everybody doing the minimum. That's not a problem for my theory necessarily. It's just to say that people doing the minimum isn't going to get us into a different equilibrium. But that's just to say, well, we do need some of these other forms, but they're not going to be what we would expect from citizens doing the minimum of upkeeping a healthy democratic system. Getting to a healthy democratic system, yes, I don't have a theory for that. Maybe I should have one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting talk. So I study trusted institutions and political participation at the local level in India, so that might help situate where some of my questions are coming from. And there are a couple, but they're related. The first, of course, is there's a normative assumption, I think, in your talk of democracy, of participation in democracy being a net good, and that people want to be good democratic citizens. But, of course, there's, to this audience, it's probably preaching to the choir, but there is distrust, there is dissatisfaction with democracy today. And so would you say that someone who's distrusting of democracy is just busy? Or is there something else that's going on there? And then relatedly, like you mentioned, identity is sort of this guiding force behind participation or the lack thereof. And it's been manufactured by political parties, I'd say. And a lot of countries, including the one that I study, it's not politically expedient for parties to make politics understandable. In fact, making it complicated is how they win. And so I would probably agree with the previous comment of parties perhaps not being the solution to all of our, to the spectrum of democratic landscapes that we have today.
Good, yes. So on the first issue of distrust, so one of the things that I want to be very capacious of different conclusions that citizens might reach. The first substantive chapter, chapter 2, pardon me, is about what it addresses the question of what's too little democratic engagement or democratic citizenship, and so I think they're about apathy in the sense of citizens entirely ignoring politics. And I conclude in that chapter that apathy is too little democratic citizenship. It's not enough engagement in politics. But if you attend to politics and find that on the issues that you find most sort of essential, most important, that it's just terrible, right? And that there are no good actors, that would, I think, could reasonably lead to a judgment of distrust. That there's no reason for me to think that politics in the place that I am now is deserving. It's not clear what my role would be as an active citizen in that type of circumstance. And that's why standby citizenship does not imply active engagement all the time, right? But I think what it does require is that you have formed a judgment of that kind, having looked at the landscape. One of the things I'm concerned about is people who have not become politically socialized, have not gone through a process of looking at what's happening in politics and have simply adopted slogans. Oh, politics is, low down, dirty, whatever, right? Like all of the kinds of socially available slogans that we have for thinking that, for dismissing politics and seeing it as an activity that is somehow disreputable and not worth my time. I think the language of distrust is one of those languages that people who have not gone through a process of sort of forming a judgment on their own, right? They might be simply trying to justify their lack of engagement. And this we do see this sometimes in surveys where people ask people certain kinds of things and they'll say, well, I told you earlier that I'm not interested in politics, and now you're asking me about politics, and I guess I need to answer in the form of somebody who doesn't care about politics. And you do get these kinds of survey responses. So on the issue of distrust, I think if you have justified, sort of epistemically responsible distrust, that's sort of fine. And that's not, I don't want to exclude that, because I think that there are reasonable conditions in which, that's a reasonable response. Now, on the issue of parties here, so here, if I understand it, and again, the Indian context is something where a party is exploiting, is trying to mislead and not is trying to create complexity where there shouldn't be any, right? Instead of making things simple. To the extent, I don't know enough about the competitive dynamics of the specifically Indian context. But insofar as parties are in a position to put forth a message that other parties are not in a position to contradict, that's a failure of political competition, it seems to me, right? And so, again, I might not say the solution to more democracy is more democracy, but I will sometimes say that the problem of parties is sometimes more parties. Take that for what it's worth, right? It's not going to work where you have hegemonic parties, right? Where you have a hegemonic party that doesn't need to compete. They're not going to need to be subject to the kinds of functions that I think parties can, in many cases, discharge.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciated your analysis of the paradox of empowerment. I think it's very true. However, I am concerned with the simplification of modes of political participation and its consequences. Because if we're simplifying modes of political participation, are we not diminishing the quality of political participation of citizens and ultimately diminishing their influence, first of all? And second of all, the alternatives you've proposed, such as increasing, well, the implication of political parties, as well as more political centralization through the abolition of federalism, is that not going to concentrate power in the hands of people who are professional politicians in a certain way, and who also are there because they have more power than the average citizen? Like, for example, they have a lot of social capital, economic capital, cultural capital, like they have diplomas and all, and ultimately by putting more power in their hands, are we not going to end up favorizing those classes, and is it not just going to lead to them promoting their interests over the interests of people who are busy, so ultimately we've just done full circle?
Good, yes. I'll take, I think there were sort of two things there, but I think the core issue is essentially having to do with representative democracy, right? Being ultimately one a form of inequality of power, and secondly, like, well, who are politicians, right? They are exactly the people that we might be concerned about. Okay, so first on the issue of sort of representative democracy. Let's see. And there's a third thing. That's right. And the third thing is deliberative mini-public. So maybe I should. Okay, so I'll start with representative democracy. Representation and delegation of certain tasks, and the creation of that relationship between trustee and delegate, or agent, the principal-agent relationship. That is like endemic to like modernity in a variety of ways, right? We create these relationships all over the place, and it is one of the ways that we're able to deal with and manage societies of vast complexity. And I tend to think about representative democracy along those lines. So there then the question becomes, what kind of a principal-agent relationship is sort of appropriate, or what are the conditions for having a relationship like that that's justifiable? And it seems to me that we can articulate lots of different ones. I don't have a full-fledged theory of representative democracy in this book, but it seems to me that if you have meaningful accountability and what that looks like, there's a lot of really great theorizing about what that can look like and what can be involved in that. I think basically it's like, yeah, take a any one of these million tools that we have in the institutional toolbox for doing that. I'm happy to talk with you maybe more after this about what particular instances of that might look like. When it comes to distrusting politicians, as you say, politicians have diplomas, they're fancy, right? They're precisely seem to be kind of the wrong kind of people. Part of my response would be to say, yes, but if we can interest them in serving our interests through institutional design, which is, I think, one of the things that representative democracy does at its best, I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem, in the same way that if you hire somebody to fix your car, right, their demographic characteristics don't make a huge difference, right, depending on what the task is. So partly that. The last thing is that I do think that there could be a role for sortition and deliberation of a particular kind, but it will not take the place of representative democracy, it seems to me. It can, so in other words, one of the ways that you might create a check on representatives who we might think are self-interested in a variety of ways. Well, what if we have some form of direct democracy? In the United States, many states have citizen initiatives, which allow citizens, groups of citizens, to write laws, potentially constitutional amendments, and then have them put on the ballot, voted on, and then added to the pile of laws or whatever it might be. There are reasons to be worried about the way that process works in a variety of states. I mentioned California has a lot of these in any given year. Some of them are not a good idea, but that's the case for lots of policies. Deliberation might be able to serve a very useful filtering purpose in a number of different places. Ireland, for instance, had a very successful version of this where they were given the task by the legislature was we don't know what to do about these 8 issues, and one of them is same-sex marriage, and one of them is abortion. There was a wide sense that the law needed to change. There was a constitutional prohibition on abortion written into the Constitution, and they were we kind of think this is out of date, but the legislature couldn't deal with it, didn't want to touch it, so they gave it to these citizens who deliberated about it and ultimately came to the decision that we should have a referendum and it should repeal this it should change the Constitution, and they did, and that's great. Right, that's a way. Now that process was initiated by the legislature, but you could imagine a similar process being initiated by citizens. So that would be a way that you can make use of representation, of deliberation and sortition in a way that creates a check on representatives and to some extent to the shortcomings of parties. Insofar as you do have broken competition, you can have an institution like the initiative, which will allow you to circumvent parties who have agreed, who have colluded to remove an issue from the agenda. This does raise Professor Roberts' concern about the problem of transition, to be sure, but the initiative didn't come from nowhere, right? It had to be enacted through the kind of processes of social mobilization that you had. And it was mobilized by a lot of other kind of substantive issues that people were concerned about. In the US, I suspect something like abortion could be an issue that is really lit a fire under a very, very substantial portion of the population. And insofar as the institutions are not set up right now to process that issue in line with the majority's preferences, the institutions might change, might need to change, insofar as that movement is we are not going to give up on this issue. So, yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I'm from India, and we have an election coming up. And I have a question regarding your ideas against federalism, against checks and balances, towards centrality. And in India, we have been seeing maybe the bad sides of consolidation of power in one hand, and it has historical sort of a background to it. As you can see, pre-war Germany, consolidation of power in one hand. How do you make sure that centrality does not lead to, or parliamentarism does not lead to parliamentary absolutism or a form of majoritarianism? And how would the rights of the self-determination rights of subnational groups fare into all of this?
Yeah. So there's a very kind of a deep question in democratic theory over the question of the protection of the rights of minorities, and one of the sort of standard ways of doing that is by writing a set of rights into a constitutional document, and then giving the courts, essentially, the power of judicial review to be able to strike down any actions of a legislature that might be incompatible with that, right? This is a fairly straightforward set of tools, or I should say a very familiar set of tools. So in many circumstances, and here is the contexts that we're talking about and the backgrounds that we bring to these questions matters a lot. When I think about this context in the history of the United States, for instance, the courts do not have a great track record of discharging that function, as a matter of fact. The problem is that the most salient example of that type of thing is like that one time that they tried to do and it didn't actually change anything, right? Brown v. Board in the US didn't actually change anything on the ground. 10 years later, 1% of black students in the South attended non-segregated schools. Pardon me, maybe 2% in any case. It didn't actually achieve it, but they tried, sort of. And then when you actually look at how groups' rights have been protected in the US, it's basically always the legislature, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, right? A huge number of acts of Congress are the things that have ultimately protected the rights of various forms of vulnerable minorities. That historical context of the United States puts me in the mind of thinking legislatures are more reliable on this score than people tend to give them credit for. And courts are not as reliable as people will sometimes give them credit for. But in the Indian context, I don't know if that set of salient examples makes a good sense of the context of Modi's India, right? Insofar as the Supreme Court has had a very, very robust role, that is to say, they've been very not shy, right, about using the power of judicial review in the Indian context. I haven't said anything about judicial review, right? That insofar as that's a check, I mean, by implication I have in terms of checks and balances. I do think that there's a role for judicial review in protecting the democratic process. To me, that seems a very straightforward way of doing it. But insofar as we're concerned about the protection of minority rights, I'm less sure about that. But I certainly think that insofar as elected parliaments attempt to prolong their power and remove opposition from being in a position to win future elections, or indeed to use the ordinary tools of democratic opposition, well, yeah, that's bad, right? And that's a taking apart of the system of representative democracy itself. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but they're a little bit outside the scope of the book, because this gets into questions about democratic backsliding in a more kind of in a more direct way. But thank you.
We unfortunately have several people left on the list who we're not going to get to, and I'm going to do the rude thing of claiming the last question for myself with the excuse that I'm going to try to put a kind of sharper combined point on a number of the questions that you've gotten. The minimum capacity that is necessary for standby citizenship is not a fixed quantity. It depends on the political context of the particular society. It depends on the stakes of politics in a particular society. I think that what we're hearing in a number of questions is the following two-part worry. One, reform in the direction that you call for, that removes the various kinds of empowerment that can be differentially taken advantage of, will discourage the acquisition of those capacities on the part of the advantaged, unequal, but nonetheless non-trivial part of the population that currently does things like go to public hearings, currently does things like research initiatives and referenda. So you will get a dampening of capacity relative to the status quo population. And you will get an increase in stakes, because the move to unitary government under a sovereign, unchecked parliament with parties that have increasing control over the media ecology creates so much more risk of a really despotic government arising democratically at the center, that what you need is standby citizens who are really at the ready, really engaged, really able to go protest, go staff the institutions of civil society and intermediacy to defend freedom against this increasingly despotic central state. And so your reforms are going to put the society into a pincher movement, dampening capacity while you're increasing what actually counts as the necessary minimum.
Yes, so, yeah. So I don't think that I would agree that the minimum changes necessarily, but what's called for in the circumstances for being a good citizen, a citizen who exceeds the minimum, right? Part of the thought here is that. Insofar as democracy itself is sort of unstable, yeah, then more might be called for from us. That's going to be a democracy that's going to, it's what's the word? Well, I mean, it's endangered, right? And so we're called to a more demanding form of participation. I think in line with what you're arguing now. If the centers of power are essentially decentralized, if you think about what the agenda of if we think of the example of abortion in the United States, what would it take for them to succeed in reversing, right, a change in policy that has resulted in, an enormous change in, let's say, the fundamental freedom of a vast number of Americans. If what they need to do is to capture power in all the state governments that have passed forms, bans, right, and they have to overcome gerrymandering in all of those spaces, that becomes a very daunting project, one that might be beyond the capacity of this organization. It might be, if not impossible, then practically impossible. Currently, it seems like control of the federal government, the central government, insofar, especially as we're talking about a national issue, right, that national majorities have fairly strong opinions on, then again, it does seem to me that when you centralize power, you're going to make it easier for majorities who have an agenda, right? In this case, an agenda of promoting freedom, to realize that agenda. Now, if the concern is that you've got majorities who want to oppress minorities, right, which is the sort of stereotypical concern that we typically have in the design of checks and balances, yeah, majoritarian democracy doesn't necessarily have an answer to that. I would just, again, I would sort of point to the history of in most of the case, this is not actually the set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. Majorities don't tend to be in that position. Authoritarian movements tend not to win elections, right? The Nazis never won an election. They were put into power in a different way. It wasn't obviously democratic in that kind of way. But I do take the point. I take the point that the centralization of power makes it easier for power to be captured by non-democratic groups and raises the stakes of politics in a way, yes. But it also makes it easier for national majorities to concentrate their efforts on a single point, right? And I do think that there's an enormous amount of advantage to that.
All right, we're going to move into our ending business. I'm going to ask you to stand here for the first part of the ending business. Please hold those two things. That's number 5.
16 Hartog?
Is 16 Hartog here? Okay, please come up and get your copy of Democracy for Busy People. Are you a current McGill student?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. All right, now you're released for the moment. Next piece of closing business is thank yous. I want to thank Nada Nasser, who is a Charles Taylor Student Fellow who does double duty as the crucial organizer for these events, as well as Jean-Félix Caron, who is the administrative coordinator for the Lynn Center and does a valuable amount of back office work. I want to thank the Institute for Liberal Studies, a generous grant from whom provides partial support for the RGCS Lecture Series. I have some things to say about what's going to happen tonight, some things to say about what happens next, and some things to say about the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. You will have heard me mention the fellowship a couple of times tonight. The RGCS Student Fellowship is an unusual feature of RGCS as a research center at McGill. It brings together 20 students by competitive application per year, a majority of them arts undergraduates, also master's students in political theory, and some students from the BCLJD program in law. On the evenings when there's an RGCS lecture, the Charles Taylor Student Fellows are here and will be in conversation with the visiting speaker through the evening. On effectively every other Thursday of the academic year when there's not a lecture, they meet in an ongoing reading group studying major texts in the history of political, moral, and social thought in a patient, in-depth, ungraded, non-credit way. This is an intellectual community of earlier stage students than is standard and characteristic of research centers and research groups at McGill. I want to say one thing about the fellowship to current students and one thing to other people. The thing to say to current students is if you are not currently a student fellow, but you are a continuing arts undergraduate, master's student, or law student, and you are interested in applying for the student fellowship next year, please contact me. I keep a running mailing list of people who have asked to get the application when it's circulated in August. I circulate it as widely as I can, but mailing lists at McGill are sometimes funny. It helps if I have actually your email address to make sure that you will get the application in August in time to be selected for the fellowship starting in the fall. The notes to everyone else. We are in the middle, almost now I think exactly in the middle, of a long-term fundraising campaign to permanently endow the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. The fellowship costs a little bit of money every year. The students receive a small stipend as well as copies of the books, and there's more money than that is sometimes devoted to allowing the students to pursue additional academic opportunities that are not characteristically available to undergraduates and master's students, including conference, travel, subsidized research assistantships, and exchange programs. That fundraising campaign is approaching what is probably its halfway point to making the fellowship permanently financially sustainable. Yesterday was McGill 24. On McGill 24, the university provided matching funds for crowdfunding contributions. McGill 24 is over, which means the matching funds are over, but the campaign for this year's part of the campaign is not yet over. If you are someone who comes to the RGCS lectures and enjoys the intellectual climate that the student fellows do so much to create at these events, I hope that you will consider making a gift in support of the fellowship's long-term future. I have put around in a couple places, I don't have one here with me, a flyer with the QR code that would take you directly to the website that would allow you to make a contribution to the long-term financial sustainability of the fellowship, or you can just ask me and I can point you to the website. Things will happen after tonight. This is the last event in this year's RGCS Lecture Series. It is not the conclusion of the programming for the year for the Jan P. Lind Center as a whole. The Lind Center has one annual lecture that brings together people from all across the center, from the now 6 research groups that make it up. That event will be 13 days from now. It is on Wednesday, March 27th. And Catherine, do you immediately remember the name of the speaker and the title? Catherine Liu, the director of the Lind Center.
Yes, it will be Professor Aisha Zarifol from the University of Cambridge. And the title of her talk is the
disorder
or disruptions of the current times unprecedented.
Yes. And that event will be in the faculty club ballroom. The only other remaining event on RGCS's public schedule for this year isn't actually at McGill, but particularly in light of Kevin being here, I want to note that this year is, I think, the now 5th iteration of the Political Theory in and as Political Science Young Scholars Workshop that spun out of the 2018 conference at which he spoke, and it will be held at NYU on May 3rd and 4th. Next year, that workshop will rotate back to McGill for the first time since the one that was held online during COVID. Things will happen tonight. Once we're actually done, I'll invite everyone to join us for a reception in the adjoining ballroom, in the adjoining reception room. People who are going to dinner tonight, I'll ask that we assemble at 6:45 on the outside staircase. Given the weather, I think that we should walk, and that will take a little bit more time. Immediately after we conclude, I'll ask the RGCS faculty and Kevin Elliott to come up here for a picture with the banner. And given this unprecedented opportunity for photos with natural light, which otherwise never happens during our programming year, it is traditional for there to be a year-end picture of all of the students and visiting alumni of the program all coming together. I'm going to ask that people, right after the faculty photo finishes, the RGCS students and returning fellowship alumni assemble on the front steps of Thompson House for an end-of-year picture of that group. I think that's all the business, except, of course, for the very important task of joining me in thanking Kevin Elliott. No, I forgot the other thing. For purposes of the video, which lives on YouTube, I like to provide footnotes back to previous lectures for people who are watching these videos on YouTube in the future and have at their disposal the archive of previous RGCS lectures. If you are interested in the themes that were raised in Kevin Elliott's lecture, then I encourage, among others, that you have a look at the lectures by Jenna Bednar, Donald Horowitz, and Jonathan Rodden especially, on federalism and the way that federalism interacts with democratic institutions. I encourage you to see the lecture by Ilya Somin, who is one of the contributors to the literature on citizen ignorance and political ignorance, of which Kevin was critical. And there was one more and I've lost it, but that's enough homework for now. All right, thank you very much, everyone.